Please turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 13. A number of years ago, Kyle McDonald, inspired by the childhood game Bigger or Better, decided to see what he could get that would be bigger or better than the red paperclip he had found. He embarked on an adventure to try to trade up from this red paperclip and see what he could gain. And he was able to make a trade. He traded the red paperclip for a fish-shaped pen, which he then traded for a weird hand-sculpted drawer knob, which he traded for a Coleman stove with some fuel included. And then he traded that for an old electric generator, which he traded for an empty keg, an IOU for filling it up with beer from the person who owned the keg, and a Budweiser sign. He traded these items for an old snowmobile. And he traded the snowmobile for a trip for two to British Columbia. This is starting to get interesting, isn't it? He traded that trip for a box truck, which he traded for a recording contract, which he traded for a year's worth of rent in Phoenix, Arizona, which he traded for, and some of you may not get this one, but it was a big deal at the time, which he traded for an afternoon with Alice Cooper. And he traded that afternoon with Alice Cooper for a motorized Kiss snow globe. This trade was lampooned online by his followers as the worst trade ever. Keep in mind, this was long before Nico traded Luca. I'm never getting over that, by the way. But Kyle traded for this Kiss snow globe, and not long after that, received word from actor Corbin Burnson, who just so happened to have a collection of over 4,600 snow globes. And Burnson was willing to trade a role in a movie he was working on for that Kiss snow globe because, in Burnson's words, not only do I want it, but I need it. And then Kyle McDonald traded that role in a movie for a house in Saskatchewan. And that was the end of his adventure. Now, how do you trade up from a red paperclip to a house? Well, with the exception of the first trade, where trading a pen for a red paperclip doesn't make much sense unless you're in handcuffs and you need to pick the lock, Kyle McDonald was able to keep trading up because value is in the eye of the beholder. The guy who traded the camping stove for that weird hand-sculpted knob had a use for that knob that he didn't have for the camping stove. Value is in the eye of the beholder. And so when we find something we value, something we want or need or decide we simply can't live without, the only remaining question is, how much are we willing to give up in order to get it? In Matthew 13, beginning in verse 44, Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. And when a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field." Again, Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. And when he found one of great value, He went away and sold everything he had and bought it. In the first parable, a man stumbles on treasure hidden in a field. Maybe he was a hired hand plowing the field. Maybe he was taking a shortcut across the field. Really, it doesn't matter how he found the treasure. The point of this story is what he does after finding the treasure. He sells everything he has so that he can acquire that found treasure. Some readers, those with ethics, read this parable and are bothered by the man's unethical behavior. The way he hides the treasure again and then takes advantage of the landowner who obviously doesn't know there's treasure hidden on his field. Would Jesus really tell a story that glorifies the shady dealings of an unethical character? And perhaps you're bothered by this as well. Or if you weren't, now you are. But I wonder if you're also bothered by the fact that Goldilocks was never prosecuted. Never prosecuted for trespassing, theft, and destruction of property. Are you bothered by the great injustice of Goldilocks never having to suffer the consequences of her criminal behavior? And if you're not bothered by Goldilocks, then I suggest there is no reason to be bothered by the man's behavior in this parable. One of the secrets to interpreting Jesus' parables is to take them as they are, stories designed to make a point, without importing external morality into the story. Because Jesus' purpose in telling this little parable is not to teach an ethical lesson or to weigh in on the principle of finders, keepers, losers, weepers. His purpose in telling this parable is to describe and emphasize the radical action generated by the discovery of something of immense value. The second story is different but similar. Only in the second story, the merchant knows what he's looking for. He's in search of fine pearls. He doesn't accidentally find the pearl. It's the result of a quest. And when he finds that pearl of supreme value that he's looking for, he does the same thing as the man in the first story. They start at different places, but they both end up at the same spot. They both go all in for their found treasure. And these parables raise for us the question, for what would you sell everything? For what would you give up everything to obtain? And setting aside for a moment that this is church and the answer is supposed to be Jesus, consider how your answer to this question depends largely on your circumstances. New Testament scholar A.J. Levine tells of teaching these parables in a maximum security prison. And she asked the inmates this question, for what would you give up everything in life to obtain? And one of the inmates immediately said, freedom. Another inmate, though, said, I would give up everything for safety. For what would you give up everything? And what would your answer be on the way home from the hospital or coming home from a funeral? For what would you give up everything to obtain? And the answer to this question need not be hypothetical. Because life is a series of trade-offs where we are constantly giving up something of value for something we perceive that has more value. And the question is, how much will you give up to get what you really want or think you need? Levine tells of The time she playfully told the inmates that the Greek word for pearl in this parable is margarita. That's true, you can look it up. The man found a margarita and sold everything he had in order to buy it. And when she told them that, playfully, one of the inmates raised her hand and said, I gave up everything. My home, my family, my food, for alcohol. Life is a series of trade-offs in which we give up something of value for something that for us is perceived more value. And not everyone makes a wise trade. When Jimmy Johnson was first hired as the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, one of the first things he did was divorce his wife of 26 years and the mother of his 2 sons so that he could focus solely on coaching football. His 2 sons grew up playing football. One of them played on scholarship at the University of Texas. And incredibly, Jimmy Johnson never saw his sons play a single game of football. His younger son fell into the grip of alcohol and drugs. Spent 10 years living on the street. And Johnson, in a recent interview, said he never knew his son was on the street. And when he finally learned of it, his priorities shifted from football to family, and he retired once and for all from coaching. And it has taken years, decades, for him to repair his relationship with his sons and make some kind of peace with his regrets. Life is a series of trade-offs. And these parables from Jesus spotlight those clarifying moments in life when our priorities shift, our values change, and we realize that what we had previously valued so highly, our career, our possessions, our accomplishment, our reputation, our independence, our freedom, whatever it is that we placed as supreme value, in an instant it shifts and we realize there's something out there that matters more. If you were to ask a wealthy homeowner what they valued more, the Rembrandt hanging in their study or the life raft stored in their garage, you would expect they would say, well, the Rembrandt. Unless a nearby dam had just broken and the flood waters are rising outside the home. Values can change, priorities can shift like that. Fred Craddock tells the story of a classmate of his who spent a number of years as a missionary ministering in China. And the man and his family were under house arrest when soldiers came and said they were free to return to America. And as the family celebrated, the soldiers also told them, and you can only take 200 pounds with you. 200 pounds. Well, they had spent years in China. They had acquired a number of possessions, and the celebration turned into a debate among the family, father, mother, 2 children. What can't we live without? Which of these possessions should we take with us? Well, I really want to take my books. Well, what about that vase that we've had? Or this typewriter that we just recently purchased? And the family had to decide what mattered most, and they made tough decisions, what to include, what to exclude, until finally they had exactly 200 pounds of possessions to take home with them. And when they told the soldiers they were ready to go, the soldiers asked, "Did you weigh everything?" "Yes, we weighed everything." What about the kids? Did you weigh the kids? No, we didn't weigh the kids. Weigh the kids. And in an instant, what they thought they could not live without lost all value. And Jesus says, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is not just like the treasure that you find. It's not just like the pearl of supreme value. It's that moment of insight when you discover the treasure. It's that moment when you find the pearl. It's that moment when your priorities shift and your values change. It's that moment when the dam breaks or when the soldiers say, weigh the kids. This is what the kingdom of heaven is like. A flash of insight when you realize what really matters. There is an echo in these parables of Proverbs chapter 4, where the father says to his son in verse 7 and 8, the beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. In other words, the beginning of wisdom is this: you must be obsessed with getting wisdom. Though it costs you all you have, get understanding. Cherish her, Lady Wisdom, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. Wisdom is worth everything you have. Or as we heard earlier from Proverbs 3:15, she, Lady Wisdom, is more precious than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with her. It is not a stretch to identify the treasure in these parables as godly wisdom, which is the ability to navigate the challenges of life, the ability to proper order the priorities of our lives in a righteous, God-honoring way. And in his gospel, Matthew makes much of the difference between wisdom and folly, the wise and the foolish. At the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, how does Jesus famously conclude the sermon? He said, let me tell you about the difference between the wise man and the foolish man. The wise man builds his house on the rock, meaning it can withstand any storm. The foolish man builds his house on the sand, and it is washed away in the flood. Well, how does the wise man, Jesus says, how does the wise man build his house on the rock? He does it by listening to and obeying the teachings of Jesus. The foolish man builds his house on the sand by ignoring the teachings of Jesus. True wisdom. True wisdom is building your life and organizing your life around the teachings of Jesus, who is God's wisdom personified. The kingdom of heaven is like that moment when your priorities shift and you go all in with Jesus because you realize he is the pearl of supreme value. The kingdom of heaven is when you realize you've been making some foolish trades, and now you will give it all up to be with Jesus, to learn from Jesus, to build your life on the teachings of Jesus. And we see these parables come to life in Jesus' ministry. Again, these are not hypothetical. Like when earlier in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus interrupts Peter and Andrew's day of fishing, and he calls them to follow him, which means he invites them to be with him so that they can become like him, so they can do what he does and live as he lives. And they respond to that call by dropping their nets, leaving everything behind, and going with Jesus. And the same happens for James and John when Jesus calls them. They leave behind their family business, which includes their boat and their father, and they go with Jesus. They may not fully understand who Jesus is or what he's come to do, but they recognize that he's the one they've been looking for. He's the treasure. He's the pearl. And they go all in. But not everyone does. Like when later on in Matthew 19, a man comes to Jesus and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And when Jesus tells him to literally reenact these parables and sell all of his possessions, give the money to the poor, and then follow him, the man goes away sad, not filled with joy, but sad, because he's wealthy. Life is a series of trade-offs, and the man values his possessions more than he valued being with and becoming more like Jesus. And it happens. Life is a series of trade-offs. And it may be that today you identify more with that wealthy man than you do Peter, Andrew, James, and John. You admire Jesus. You're fascinated by Jesus. You might even occasionally ask Jesus for some advice. But you're not yet ready to go all in with him. You're not yet ready to entrust your life, your future, your well-being to him. You're not yet ready to build your life on his teachings. And frankly, our exploration of these parables today has done nothing to change your mind or stir your heart. Fair enough. There is a secondary way to read these parables. And that is to see Jesus as the man in the field. Or even better, as the merchant in search of fine pearls. And to see ourselves as the pearl of supreme value, for whom Jesus gives up everything. It is true that Jesus expects us, calls us, demands of us that we organize and prioritize our lives around him. He's the Lord. And it is true that Jesus calls us to build our lives on his way of life. It is true that when we recognize Jesus as the treasure or the pearl of supreme value, we are called to joyfully go all in with him. And the bigger mess we've made of our lives, the more foolish our trades have been throughout our lives, the better news this is, and the more joyfully we do so. But it is also true that long before our priorities begin to shift, while we are still out there making foolish trades, long before we go all in with him, Jesus has already gone all in with and for us. He is the pearl of supreme value, but he is also the one who gives his life for what he treasures. So now let's go to the table and remember and celebrate the one who saw us, loved us, and judged us to be worthy, to be of such great value that he would willingly sacrifice himself to make us his own.